Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you for ensuring that members get their time despite the obvious obstructionary tactics by the Liberal National Caucus Chair. But nonetheless, thank you, Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Bashir, Mr. Utano suggested to you or indicated to you to submit two proposals, one through GC Strategies and one directly to CBSA. Is that correct? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Thank you for the question. Just a small clarification. It was the same proposal. So we initially was requested to submit it to Mr. Utano, which we did. Subsequently met with Mr. Utano to discuss the details of it. And it was at that subsequent meeting where he said, I'd like you to send a copy of this to Mr. Firth at GC Strategies.
So it was the exact same proposal for the exact same amounts in both submissions?
That's correct. It was the same. It was a PowerPoint presentation to be specific, but it was the exact same presentation. Yes.
Could you remind the committee what was the dollar figure attached to that submission?
Thank you for the question. I recall it was two separate, so it's going to be a little long-winded, but I apologize. It was originally going to be two separate task authorizations, the first being more of a technical control review. That was in the amount of $255,000. And the second half, the second task authorization was more procedural in nature, reviewing policies, procedures of the sort, and that was for $145,000 for a grand total of $400,000.
And did you in fact receive $400,000 from GC Strategies for your work?
From GC Strategies, yes, that is correct.
And you would have expected to receive a similar amount or the exact same amount had you dealt directly with CBSA?
That is correct.
So by going through GC Strategies, you still got paid the same amount, but taxpayers in the great scheme of things paid more. Is that a good assumption?
That is my understanding of what happened, yes.
Okay. You talked about meeting with Mr. Firth 2 to 3 times while you were at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat as a senior government official, as a Director General. But you made the comment that they were like any other vendor. In response to another question, you said that there was an element of understanding where the industry was heading. My question to you, though, is were you aware that GC Strategies actually doesn't do any IT work? Were you aware of that at the time?
Thanks for the question. I did not know the nature of GC Strategies business, in great depth. What I did know about them, and to give Mr. Firth credit, he thoroughly read a recent IT strategy we had posted in 2017, 2018, and responded or sent an email, which obviously I had a public email address at the time, sent an email saying that he had some suggestions on how I might be able to achieve some of those strategic objectives. And so I didn't do any research in the company. I took the meeting as I would of any other vendor who would come up with a good idea to investigate further.
So he flim-flammed you. He made you. He flim-flammed you. He made you think that they were a reputable IT company when really they were two guys who were operating a business. He was able to write you a nice email, compliment you on some strategies, and convince you that they were actually a reputable company like any other when really they weren't. Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, I don't know the term that you use there, but what I would suggest is he brought two valid products to the table. Two secure, one was secure communications, as I mentioned. One was digital identity. When I looked up those products, they're legitimate products that he had aligned himself with. So, kudos to him for finding the right products out there.
I guess kudos for him for pulling the wool over a lot of people's eyes over a number of years and making himself quite wealthy off of it. But I want to go briefly to the risk management process that you spoke of within KPMG. Are there two questions? First of all, are there records of that process, and would you be willing to share that information with this committee? That's the first question.
Thank you for the question. We have records of all of these processes, and I'll take that back to the team to see what can be shared.
Okay, I look forward to hopefully seeing that. Second is, what information did you provide to that process within KPMG of your past interactions with GC Strategies? Were they aware that you had personally met with them on at least 2, maybe 3 occasions as a senior official with the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat?
Thanks for the question. I don't recall that being one of the fields that I talked about earlier that had to be filled out regarding personal meetings with the organization. The process is more about testing the legitimacy of the organization. It's I think we look for any public knowledge of lawsuits or things of that nature, and nothing came up at that time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Chair. And it's too bad that the Liberal National Caucus Chair doesn't like our questions, but unfortunately, the government failed, and we have to ask questions on behalf of Canadians so that taxpayer money is properly spent. Mr. Bashir, you mentioned that you would have briefed your leadership team on your meetings with GC Strategies. Who were the members that you would have briefed on those meetings?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier, given the time frame, it likely would have been Mark Briard.
So you said leadership team. Was it more than one person or just Mr. Brouillard?
Well, he was my assistant deputy minister at the time. There were a number of other director generals that may have been present, but generally the debrief would have been back like upwards to the assistant deputy minister, yes.
Would that have been oral brief or would there have been written documentation?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier, generally the debriefs, they varied. Sometimes if there was substance, there would be in writing. Sometimes it was a conversation during a bilateral meeting in person.
Well, given that Mr. Brouillard was the Chief Technology Officer of Canada, do you not think he might have had some line of sight onto a company like GC Strategies, which supposedly was a IT technology company?
Thank you for the question. I can't speak to Mr. Briard's line of sight into the companies that he knows.
I'll ask you that then. Did he offer any concerns about GC Strategies?
Thank you for the question. At that time, no concerns were raised.
So Mr. Brouillard was the Chief Technology Officer of Canada. Who currently holds that position?
Thank you for the question. I don't actually. I think last I heard it was Min Doan, but I believe he's on leave of absence, so I'm not sure who is acting in the role at the moment.
Min Doan, that name rings a bell with this committee. Have you ever met with Min Doan?
Thank you for the question. Certainly in government context, we were on the same committee, I believe, the Enterprise Architecture Review Board. So we sat, across the table from one another in a format similar to this, but didn't really work with them too closely.
Did you ever have any conversations with Min Doan after leaving government?
After leaving, thank you for the question. The only time was likely during the presentation of our findings of the CBSA cybersecurity assessment that we conducted. I remember presenting those findings to a CBSA committee, and I believe that Mr. Doan was present at that meeting.
Do you have any records from that meeting?
Thank you for the question. At best, probably a meeting invite. But I'd have to get back to you on that.
Who else do you recall having been at that meeting with Mr. Doan?
Certainly Mr. Utano would have been present, likely some of his team members as well, and other members. It was a steering committee, as I recall, a CBSA steering committee. So I don't know all the names off the top of my head, but I suggest that it would likely be a series of IT leaders, if I can characterize it that way.
Could you get back to us if you have any documentation of who would have been at that meeting?
Certainly, I'll take that back and get back to whatever I can.
Does KPMG, or you specifically in your role, have any dealings with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Thank you for the question. So first, me personally, no, I've not had any dealings with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I can't speak on behalf of the entire firm. I could take that back and get back to you, but to my knowledge, I don't know of any. But Ms. Lee, I don't know if
same answer. I'm not aware.
And what about Treasury Board Secretariat?
Thank you for that question as well. I recently completed a small engagement with the Office of the Comptroller General in the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, where it was a roughly $30,000 engagement to provide security advice and guidance on a horizontal audit of IT security. That was the last engagement I had signed with the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat.
Did you have any previous dealings with those individuals at the Comptroller General's office while you were a public servant?
Thank you for the question. When it comes to dealings, not like I didn't work with them on a regular basis. I certainly would have passed by them in the hall and said hello, but no, we didn't have any work, regularly. It could be given that I was in the office of the Chief Information Officer, and they were in a completely separate branch.
So I only have a few seconds left, but I want to go back. You mentioned that you would have briefed your employer, your manager, but you don't know how you did it. Could you commit in review to come back to this committee with a confirmation of how you would have briefed your manager, and who you would have briefed, whether it was Mr. Brouillard or whether it was others as well, and any documentation, can you provide that to this committee of how you briefed your supervisors following your meetings with GC Strategies?
I'll certainly do what I can. I hope, the committee understands and respects. I don't have access to my former inbox at Treasury Board, so I couldn't provide the records themselves, but I can certainly do my best to summarize what I recall.
Thank you. If you could do that, and if you're even a response, if you get a response, great. And if you find the department does not allow you access to your records, we will take that into consideration as